Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm the slot between you and coffee and cake. So we have 20 minutes together, and then there's another break coming up before the final session of the day. So my name is Neil Foxley from Neustar. You may or may not have heard of us. We are a global cloud services provider delivering a number of managed security solutions, DDoS mitigation being one of them, which is one of the subjects that we'll be talking about today. Going to be looking at some of the findings that we've had from a global survey of customers across medium to large enterprises, as well as some of the experience that we have as a service provider protecting customers all over the world, including customers in this region, from DDoS attacks, which I'm sure, as you can all appreciate, is not actually a new problem. Certainly a future generation problem, though, to talk about. So all of you guys have got very challenging jobs and problems to deal with within your lines of business, from a technology business use case, a new technology adoption point of view. So there's some fundamental conversations that we come across again and again when we're looking at the security situations that our customers face. More and more of you are moving applications to the cloud. Some of you may be just taking your first step into that. Some of you may be fully embraced in various types of cloud formation, be they public, private. The challenges that you're facing traditionally may have been network-based security threats, and now you're moving applications to the cloud. How are you dealing with the challenges associated to having applications that were network-based that are now in somebody else's in service? The nature of the attacks, the nature of the threats associated to those applications and manifest themselves in DDoS are changing dramatically as well. So once upon a time, it was quite obvious when a DDoS attack was coming in because they were quite simple volumetric attacks. But there's more complex, more challenging types of attack and situation that you guys are managing. And DDoS, again, nothing new. This has been going on for a long time. I know that there's been some fairly high-profile issues that have faced customers in this region, but they're still commanding attention, right? You see weekly reports in various trade and technology presses of websites being down, government websites, retail websites, banking websites. It affects all of us. It's not a regional or a vertical market thing. We're seeing different types of attack going up the application stack as well. As a provider of protection, we obviously can analyze the types of attacks coming in, and we're seeing more and more layer 7 orientated attacks, which by their very nature can be a bit more complex for you to manage if you're trying to do it yourself, or obviously for people like us. I think the important thing is that we're now seeing a demand and an expectation that you guys have got an always-on security stance. And with DDoS, that's definitely something that's a relevant topic. So just looking at some of the threat conversations and the trends that we're seeing specific to DDoS. Volumetric attacks, something which unfortunately I'm sure some of you have been on the wrong end of. The statistics I'm presenting are actually based on a survey of 1,200 businesses around the world, 600 of which are in Europe, and around 75 from this region. So they represent medium to large businesses across a number of sectors. And during a 6-month period, those customers that had been attacked were seeing an average of 6.6 gigs, being the average attack size. Not a pleasant experience for anybody. We're seeing customers coming under attack for longer periods of time as well. They may not be high-level, high-volume attacks, but they can be sustained. And those sustained attacks are actually quite often a deception tactic, which we'll be touching on a bit later as well. We're seeing more advanced, more diverse type of attacks. We're seeing people coming at it from multi-vectors, using a number of different DDoS techniques to try and confuse, distract, and frustrate the administrators or the people managing the network. A lot of the conversations that were going on earlier and some of the other speakers talked about the change in motivation behind the bad guys. Nation-state discussions that were going on in the very first session. perhaps not as relevant to DDoS against small businesses and medium businesses as you would expect, but we're seeing industrial espionage cases where DDoS for hire services are being taken out by businesses against other businesses, believe it or not. Geopolitical activity. There's obviously a lot of weird and wonderful things going on in the world of politics at the moment, and DDoS attacks are often the follow-up to something quite political. Only recently, the Dutch governmental elections, the election website was DDoSed on the day of election, so proving a point from somebody with an opinion about what was going on. Touched on the nature of the attacks changing, becoming more sophisticated, and people are now having to deal with more complex, more frequent, and more challenging attacks. This has been driven by the vehicle that they're using to attack you. So the Mirai botnet, I'm sure it's a term that most of you have heard, came to everybody's attention last year. We're going to look at that in just a bit of detail in a minute. But the nature of the botnets and the scale of these botnet armies that are out there now is quite impressive, if I'm being honest. We've read reports that talk about the Mirai botnet being something in the region of 400,000 infected IoT devices, and we're seeing new strains and new variations of these botnets evolving. 400,000 infected devices, which are available for hire for a few $1,000s. So quite worrying when we look at the number of devices and the number of infected devices out there. And people are being quite intelligent about the way they're attacking businesses, so looking for programming flaws between user interfaces and applications. So attacking businesses and organizations at the heart of what they're doing. We've seen some very weird scenarios where people have been DDoSed, things like internet-based camera links for CCTV security cameras in the UK. We believe that there's been some terrorist activity trying to isolate and take down certain links that provide CCTV coverage for certain areas so that people can essentially disappear from surveillance, using a DDoS attack to do that. It's the kind of stuff you'd expect to see in movies, right? But it's actually happening. So how did we get here? What's happened in the journey that we've all been on for the last couple of years? So, DDoS attacks going back 2 or 3 years were a distraction, were a nuisance. They weren't something that you would necessarily feel you were likely to be the target of in terms of big volumetric attacks. And only 2 years ago, we were seeing the average large attack being around 250 gig. The Rio Olympics changed the game. We started seeing 500 gig plus attacks aimed at broadcasting organizations, taking those sites offline. Obviously, one of the highest profile events with the biggest impact, which is what they were looking for. And then this time last year, the game really changed. The level went up to a terabyte plus. Within the space of a week, we saw a couple of really big service providers taken down, including one of the world's largest DNS networks, which is quite a worrying activity when you think about the number of companies that are using that DNS. That was a 2.5-hour outage of all DNS services for some of the world's largest businesses. So the trends have been dramatic in terms of their increase. These figures are something that we produce every 6 months. There's a new report coming out in just a couple of weeks. So if you keep in touch with us, we can give you the updated figures from the period of May to October. But what I'd like you to take away from this is really just looking at the changes between what was going on between 2016 and 2017. The number of what we class now as big attacks, 10 gig and upwards, is increasing. And we're seeing a kind of baseline in smaller attacks because I think people have got better readiness and better resources to protect themselves. So, there's a worrying trend there. How many of you could, with your network alone, defend a multi-10, 20, 30, 40 gig attack, which is why there's more focus being put on how people are protecting against these bigger attacks. So it's not just the attacks, it's the impact of the attack. So we ask questions of the market that we talk to, and we're looking at 1,200 organizations globally. 84% of them admitted to having been attacked. Some of the questions I heard earlier were, have you been attacked, or have you not been attacked, when FC was talking, and there was a few hands to the negative there, but it's worrying, right? Everybody can probably put their hand on an experience they've had in their organization that's an attack of some kind like this. The worrying trend, and this is a global one, we're going to break it down into how it affects Europe just a second. 53% increase on the number of ransomware-associated incidents. So a DDoS attack being matched with a ransomware experience at the same time. So I'm sure there was a lot of conversations in other presentations about ransomware. It's obviously a problem, but when you put it together with a DDoS attack, it's a double problem. And some businesses really struggle to handle one or other of those, put them together, and it's quite a challenge. So obviously here in Europe, we appreciate understanding how it affects our regional business. We actually bucked the trend somewhat in Europe. The ransomware experience at 27% was actually 15% the year before. So we've seen over 10% increase in the number of ransomware attacks. So that goes, I think, in line with the experience that the other vendors are talking about with the increase in ransomware. And fairly worrying trends globally. North America, clearly still the #1 target. And hopefully we don't get ourselves above 80% in this part of the world anytime soon. So the challenges that you're facing are that these attacks are becoming harder to detect. And they're getting harder to respond to in many cases. So some of these are quite alarming statistics. I'm not sure how many of you are involved in retail or kind of consumer-facing businesses. But if you're the head of IT and your CEO or managing director phones you and says, I've just had a call from the press, our website's down, why are we not online? And you weren't able to respond or to answer that question, that's quite worrying. So we've seen a dramatic increase in businesses only becoming aware of an attack because somebody outside the business told them. That's not good for business, in my opinion, and a rather worrying statistic. I think the fact that it's taking businesses longer to detect and longer to respond shows that these attacks are perhaps more complex, more difficult to manage in terms of their nature. And the departments who are managing these issues are maybe under stress and strain of other issues at the same time. A ransomware attack and a DDoS attack, for example. So we can actually break it down into certain lines of business. Hopefully there's not too many of you that fall into this bucket here with some rather alarming statistics. We expect financial services to be a target of any attack, right? Money leads to money. We see some fairly alarming statistics there. The fact that it's taking them a dramatic increase in time to respond in the financial services. Your bank is offline, your insurance platform's offline, your trading platforms are offline. That's not good for business. And in these challenging times, everybody's looking at the bottom line productivity and investment from IT. Retail, again, an obvious target because take a retail site offline and nobody's making any money. I think some of the statistics here are slightly different in their nature because if we look at the way that a lot of retail websites are hosted, it could be through a number of third-party providers. The administrators within the business may not be directly responsible or accountable for the activity day to day. And it's things like the SLAs that are in place, the service that's being provided by third parties. So definitely some challenges there where perhaps those retail businesses don't have full control and full visibility of what it is they're trying to protect against. So there's obviously a number of things to talk about, right? And obviously what we're focusing on here is just some ideas for you to look at within your organization. Perhaps a point in time to assess your position against DDoS readiness. So the Mirai botnet was a game changer. It's opened everybody's eyes to the capabilities of DDoS for hire services. And it's certainly not going to go away. We're basically predicting that we'll see sort of 2 terabit grade attacks fairly soon. It's a question of time. We've seen a number of 1.2 to 1.5 grade attacks out there across the world on different organizations. There's more infected IoT devices. That's going to make a bigger botnet. That's going to make a bigger problem for everybody, because soon there'll be a botnet with 1 million devices rather than 400,000. So it's going to get more complex and more difficult to protect ourselves against this. So the readiness of these resources, by the way, is the problem, right? It's not difficult to rent a DDoS for hire service. That's quite an alarming thing to say. In the last year, I think a lot of organizations have been made to look at what's going on in terms of their readiness for DDoS protection. And now they're starting to see that DDoS is a complementary service to other bad things that could happen to them. So this awareness of ransomware and associating it to DDoS is something that I would suggest you all go back to your businesses and think about and talk internally. The conversations are going higher up the chain about the availability and readiness for DDoS protection. So, clearly high-profile incidents cause executives and leaders to get involved in these things. Make sure that you're not the ones that get drawn into the meeting with the head of the business or the head of the company to ask why you weren't protected and why you weren't protected to a high enough level. So we understand that there's lots of service providers out there providing you with services. And I would suggest looking at the SLAs. I would suggest understanding if there's limits to the type of attack you're protected against, because you don't choose to be attacked, and you don't choose the size of the attack. It comes to you, right? So we, as Neustar, as I mentioned earlier, are providing a cloud-based offering. We're in the middle of a massive upgrade of our network to take us to a 10 terabit capacity at the beginning of next year. We're ready for the arms race. I think we're building for 5-6 years out. Hopefully it takes that long before the attacks get that big. We're actually putting a scrubbing center, a cloud scrubbing center into Stockholm in the next few months. So we have a number across Europe already. That will increase. By the time we're finished, we'll be at just over 4 terabits just within Europe. Across a 27-node network around the world. So we're ready for the next generation of bad DDoS attacks. Hopefully it doesn't get that bad. The guy who's got his face on the screen there is actually the pioneer, if you like, of cloud-based scrubbing. He set Prolexic up, which was the first successful cloud scrubbing DDoS solution. He's actually now in charge of all of our R&D. So Barrett Lyon, we'll try and get him involved in some events in Europe soon, hopefully. And just to give you an idea, we consider DDoS protection a challenge that can be met and discussed in other ways as well. So we haven't touched on it here in the interest of time. But one of the other areas that you could be under attack from is at the DNS level. So it's not just your applications, it's not just your public-facing sites and services that could be attacked. If your DNS is taken offline by the DNS service provider being attacked, then your website's offline as well. So ultimately, you've got to look at the stance that you have, the readiness that you have, both for your resources that you're controlling, but also things like third-party platforms and services such as DNS. So those are all areas I would suggest need review in most companies. So a few takeaway points, and certainly conversations that we come across quite commonly in Europe. DDoS is no longer just a tick box. It shouldn't just be something that you consider to be covered by an existing agreement without checking. Yes, there's different ways of doing it. There's different hardware solutions on the market. There's different cloud service providers. There's different hybrid approaches you could take. I would suggest an investigation and a review and an assessment, given the game-changing figures that we're seeing now, is a good idea. This is not a problem that can just be dealt with by putting more hardware in place, and obviously that's something which you have to consider understanding your environment. But if your network capacity is overloaded by a DDoS attack, it doesn't really matter how many boxes you put in, because they're not necessarily going to be able to do very much. And fingers crossed is no longer the approach. DDoS attacks don't necessarily mean that they're targeted at you. You could just be the unlucky recipient on their list of IPs and services to be attacked. It doesn't have to be a targeted, aimed at you objective attack. This could happen to anybody, and unfortunately we see too many cases of that. So in the interest of time, I think I'm 19 seconds over at the moment, Emmy, so fairly good. And some other conversation starters for you to maybe look at with your colleagues. Myself, Anna and Lars are here today as well. So if anybody wants to have any follow-up conversations and talk to us in more detail, we've got the reports that you could take away and have a look at and share with colleagues in your business. There's some very interesting statistics in there. And if you keep in touch with us, we'll update the market with new statistics. So if you're having conversations about what should we do about DDoS protection, how should we look at this within the business, those reports and the independent kind of feedback that we get from around the world is a good benchmark for you to look at. So 1 minute over, I do apologize.
I think you did well.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Neil.